This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
BFM 89.9, you're listening to The Morning Run with Shazana, Chuang and Chen Li. Now, we are turning our attention to something the Prime Minister said a few days ago. Prime Minister Datuk Seri Ismail Sabri Yaakob told news portal Nikkei Asia that the government is keen to bring back the Goods and Services Tax, or GST. Now, to recap, the unpopular GST policy was introduced in 2015 by Datuk Seri Najib Razak's administration at a rate of 6%.
And it was then replaced by the Sales and Services Tax, or SST, by the Pakatan government in 2018 as part of its manifesto. And in 2016, the government collected 41.2 billion ringgit from the GST, which made up 19.4% of the government revenue that year.
With rising cost of living putting immense pressure on economic purses, is this really the right time to reintroduce GST, and how should it be implemented? For some answers, we speak to Carmelo Ferlito, CEO at the Centre for Market Education. Carmelo, good morning. Always good to have you. Now, we know that you're in favor of reintroducing the GST. You've long called for it. Give us your most persuasive arguments for reinstating this tax measure.
Hi, good morning. Yes, I've always been in favor of GST, but I want to be clear. I'm in favor of reintroducing GST as a part of a more comprehensive tax reform. So as I have mentioned in several occasions, I'm in favor of better taxes, not more taxes. So I think that GST reintroduction should be accompanied by a reduction in income tax, so that the burden on individuals is proportionated, is not increasing, and at the same time better enforcement for the collection of the existing taxes. So having said that, I think that the advantage of GST is that it's more easy to be collected in a system that has some structural deficiencies in the moment of collection. And my main concern is actually not simply to replenish the federal coffers, but to have a tax system that nudge in favor of saving. So a consumption tax can help supporting a saving-oriented mentality, so shifting our growth model and make it more stable and oriented towards saving, because I believe that savings are the necessary pillar to build and to generate investments. So that is my, let's say, the background of my opinion.
Carmelo, can you get more granular? If you are advocating income tax reductions, for which band, by how much, and do you leave corporations alone?
No, I think that we should reduce income tax for both corporate and individuals. We should make it even more flat than what it is now, so even for more easy implementation. As far as as regarding the percentage, I think it is a matter for further discussion. Probably in this moment we cannot do much, but thinking about 1 or 2% decrease in income tax by implementing at the same time better enforcement. So increasing the tax basis, which is really probably the biggest problem that Malaysian government has, I think would be appropriate.
But the public has a negative perception on GST. How would you address arguments that GST is burdensome on the people, especially the purchasing power of low-income households amidst rising cost of living?
Yeah, I think that if we are going to reintroduce GST, we should probably make it progressive. So by dividing goods into several categories and having exemption, so zero rate GST for essential goods, so to avoid to burden the lowest segments of the population, and having let's say 3, 6 and 10% rates for different categories of goods, going from the most essentials to the most luxury goods, let's say.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you don't advocate a broad GST of, say, 6% from the last time. You're saying that different GST rates for different segments. From an implementation perspective, though, because GST was actually quite complex to roll out the first time around, does that make it burdensome for the people who are, the segments of corporations that are introducing those GSTs?
Well, actually, I had the chance to follow up in the private sector, both the implementation of GST and SST. And I must admit that SST was even much more complicated than GST. The GST mechanism was pretty similar to the mechanism that is adopted almost everywhere worldwide with the VAT. And also the progressivity of VAT is something very common around the world. So I think that we have quite a big number of examples from which we can take inspiration.
Carmelo, those opposed to bringing back the GST have said that the regime from 2015 to 2018 hadn't resulted in a revenue boom as touted. I mean, from your observations, did the GST benefit the broader Malaysian economy during the short period of time that it was implemented?
I think, that the government collection of money benefit the people if the money are spent in a certain way. So it doesn't really matter if you collect it with a certain tax or with another one. The real difference is how you spend the money. In fact, at this regard, I'm in favor of a higher level of delocalization in the collection of revenues, fiscal revenues, so giving more power at the single states rather than the federal governments, because I think that the more we go closer to the citizens, the more we are able to implement plans that are closer to the actual needs of the citizens.
And Carmelo, in terms of rolling out GST or re-rolling out GST, you would see that among the political narratives, there's quite a lot of tailwinds behind BN, and they want to call GE15. Do you think that if they reintroduce GST, that political goodwill is somehow dented? And how would they reintroduce GST? What kind of political narrative will they employ?
Well, I'm not a politician, so probably they will wait after elections to do this, because I believe that it may be quite unpopular to introduce this before elections, unless they are really, really good in implementing a narrative that focus on how the money are spent rather than how the money are collected.
And you spoke earlier about a little briefly about SST. What are the benefits of implementing GST versus the SST?
One thing that I have observed on the field is, in example, among other things, that SST creates some problems for the non-manufacturing companies. Non-manufacturing companies, trading companies are not SST subjects, so they pay SST on the purchases that they do from manufacturing entities, but they cannot charge the SST back to their customers, and they cannot claim that SST as a fiscal credit. So they are going to absorb an extra cost, which is even transferred to consumers with an increase in price, or simply kept there to reduce the margin. So there is a big chunk of our corporate world which absorb SST as a net cost, while GST was more equally distributed among the corporate world and based on the compensation between fiscal credits and fiscal debits. So in this sense was probably more equal in the corporate world. At the same time, SST presented a higher number of exemptions, exceptions, and arbitrary decisions of the good categories. So I think the GST was somehow simpler and more equal compared to SST.
And just to cap it, we've got about a minute left on the clock. Carmelo, you did say earlier that the GST needs to be done in tandem with other tax reforms. What other tax reforms do you think should be implemented alongside GST? We know that GST isn't a silver bullet. We can't call it a silver bullet. So what other tax reforms should be given priority?
So I think, as I mentioned, reduction of income tax, better enforcement. We should start to think about capital gain tax, probably as well, and higher level of delocalization in the collection of revenues.
Carmelo, thanks very much for speaking to us today. That was Carmelo Ferlito, CEO at the Center for Market Education, weighing in on the proposal to bring back the goods and services tax, putting forward his best arguments on why this proposal has merits.
Considering that GST was the political lever that won PH its election victory in 2018, it seems almost incredible that only a 4-year period later that this whole discussion is taking place again. And it's being proposed by the existing, BN government, which is interesting, which is even more interesting, which then makes me wonder how, what kind of state the government coffers are in. And if they do consider when are they going to do it, how are they going to position it, and what sort of narrative they're going to propose. As Carmelo says, maybe it happens after the election. Once they've won the mandate, then they use that mandate to introduce it. And if they do, how is it going to be segmented? As he said, is it going to come with a with a kind of like a carrot and lure side in terms of income taxes going down, corporation taxes going down, GST being reintroduced? A lot of things to unpack there.
Actually, I agree with Carmelo on what he said about how you do a different tier tax for different goods. Maybe for more essential goods like food and all that, you do a lower tax, or on luxury goods, you do a higher tax. I think that makes sense. And I actually also agree with him on doing away with income tax, maybe, or not doing away, but maybe lowering it to some extent to boost savings, and also to put this GST in place, and then to actually, curb the personal debt and all that.
So we have been running a poll on our Twitter and Facebook accounts. If you haven't weighed in, you still can vote. Head on over to those platforms. We're at BFM Radio on both of them. We've been asking you what you thought about the proposal that GST could make a comeback. And the results so far, 44% of you say no, don't bring it back. 34% say yes, bring it back. 21% say they are on the fence. And I just want to give a sampling of some of the responses that we've received. We have a tweet from AJ, who represents the no camp. He says, please reduce all the red tape, bureaucracy, wasteful resources. Don't throw more fire into fire. Adding more burdens to the rakyat is not the solution when the government is inefficient. And I think a lot of people do feel that way about having to introducing new taxes at a time when cost of living is so high. But at the same time, we also have Adrian Tan, who says that it's good to have a wide tax base and then channel back direct assistance to the poor, restart with low GST rate, improve the country's global standing on corruption and bigotry as well. So lots of comments there. Do weigh in. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned to BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.